Life of Mine Part 4. Truly I had to deal with a kind of Dionysius the tyrant, a man who did not acknowledge Beethoven's genius beyond his Second Symphony, a man who looked upon the Eroica as the acme of bad taste on the master's part, who praised Mozart alone, and next to him tolerated only line painter. Such a man was not easy to approach, and I had to learn the art of making use of tyrants for one's own purposes. I dissimulated. I pretended to be struck by the novelty of his ideas, never contradicted him, and, to point out the similarity of our standpoints, I referred him to the end fugue in my overture and in my symphony, both in C major, which I had only succeeded in making what they were through having studied Mozart. My reward soon followed. Diony set to work to study my orchestral creations with almost youthful energy. The students of the conservatoire were compelled to practice with the greatest exactitude my new symphony under his dry and terribly noisy baton. In the presence of several of my friends, amongst whom was also the dear old Count Pata in his capacity of president of the Conservatoire Committee, we actually held a first performance of the greatest work that I had written up to that date. During these musical successes, I went on with my love-making in the attractive house of Count Pata under the most curious circumstances. A confectioner of the name of Hascha was my rival. He was a tall, lanky young man who, like most bohemians, had taken up music as a hobby. He played the accompaniments to Augusta's songs and naturally fell in love with her. Like myself, he hated the frequent visits of the cavaliers, which seemed to be quite the custom in this city, but while my displeasure expressed itself in humor, his showed itself in gloomy melancholy. This mood made him behave boorishly in public. For instance, one evening, when the chandelier was to be lighted for the reception of one of these gentlemen, he ran his head purposely against this ornament and broke it. The festive illumination was thus rendered impossible. The Countess was furious, and Hascha had to leave the house never to return. I well remember that the first time I was conscious of any feelings of love, these manifested themselves as pangs of jealousy, which had, however, nothing to do with real love. This happened one evening when I called at the house. The Countess kept me by her side in an anteroom, while the girls, beautifully dressed and gay, flirted in the reception room with those hateful young noblemen. All I had ever read in Hoffmann's tales of certain demoniacal intrigues, which until that moment had been obscure to me, now became really tangible facts, and I left Prague with an obviously unjust and exaggerated opinion of those things and those people, through whom I had suddenly been dragged into an unknown world of elementary passions. On the other hand, I had gained by my stay at Pravinin. I had written poetry as well as musical compositions. My musical work was a setting of Glockentone, a poem by the friend of my youth, Theodore Apel. I had already written an aria for soprano which had been performed the winter before at one of the theater concerts. But my new work was decidedly the first vocal piece I had written with real inspiration. Generally speaking, I suppose it owed its characteristics to the influence of Beethoven-esque Liederkreis. All the same, the impression that it has left on my mind is that it was absolutely part of myself and pervaded by a delicate sentimentality which was brought into relief by the dreaminess of the accompaniment. My poetical efforts lay in the direction of a sketch of a tragioperatic subject, which I finished in its entirety in Prague under the title of Die Hochzeit, The Wedding. I wrote it without anybody's knowledge, and this was no easy matter, seeing that I could not write in my chilly little hotel room, and had therefore to go to the house of Moritz, where I generally spent my mornings. I remember how I used quickly to hide my manuscript behind the sofa as soon as I heard my hostess' footsteps. An extraordinary episode was connected with the plot of this work. Already years ago, I had come across a tragic story whilst perusing Bushing's book on chivalry, the like of which I have never since read. A lady of noble birth had been assaulted one night by a man who secretly cherished a passionate love for her, and in the struggle to defend her honor, superhuman strength was given her to fling him into the courtyard below. The mystery of his death remained unexplained until the day of his solemn obsequies, when the lady herself, who attended them and was kneeling in solemn prayer, suddenly fell forward and expired. The mysterious strength of this profound and passionate story made an indelible impression upon my mind. Fascinated, moreover, by the peculiar treatment of similar phenomena in Hoffmann's tales, I sketched a novel in which musical mysticism, which I still loved so deeply, played an important part. The action was supposed to take place on the estate of a rich patron of the fine arts. A young couple was going to be married and had invited the friend of the bridegroom, an interesting but melancholy and mysterious young man, to their wedding. Intimately connected with the whole affair was a strange old organist. The mystic relations which gradually developed between the old musician, the melancholy young man, and the bride were to grow out of the unravelment of certain intricate events in a somewhat similar manner to that of the medieval story above related. Here was the same idea: the young man mysteriously killed, the equally strange sudden death of his friend's bride, and the old organist found dead on his bench after the playing of an impressive requiem, the last chord of which was inordinately prolonged as if it never would end. I never finished this novel, but as I wanted to write the libretto for an opera, I took up the theme again in its original shape and built on this, as far as the principal features went, the following dramatic plot. Two great houses had lived in enmity and had at last decided to end the family feud. The aged head of one of these houses invited the son of his former enemy to the wedding of his daughter with one of his faithful partisans. The wedding feast is thus used as an opportunity for reconciling the two families. Whilst the guests are full of the suspicion and fear of treachery, their young leader falls violently in love with the bride of his newly found ally. His tragic glance deeply affects her. The festive escort accompanies her to the bridal chamber, where she is to await her beloved, Leaning against her tower window, she sees the same passionate eyes fixed on her and realizes that she is face to face with a tragedy. When he penetrates into her chamber and embraces her with frantic passion, she pushes him backwards towards the balcony and throws him over the parapet into the abyss, from whence his mutilated remains are dragged by his companions. They at once arm themselves against the presumed treachery and call for vengeance. Tumult and confusion fill the courtyard. The interrupted wedding feast threatens to end in a night of slaughter. The venerable head of the house at last succeeds in averting the catastrophe. Messengers are sent to bear the tidings of the mysterious calamity to the relatives of the victim. The corpse itself shall be the medium of reconciliation. For, in the presence of the different generations of the suspected family, Providence itself shall decide which of its members has been guilty of treason. During the preparations for the obsequies, the bride shows signs of approaching madness. She flies from her bridegroom, refuses to be united to him, and locks herself up in her tower chamber. Only when, at night, the gloomy though gorgeous ceremony commences, does she appear at the head of her women to be present at the burial service, the gruesome solemnity of which is interrupted by the news of the approach of hostile forces and then by the armed attack of the kinsmen of the murdered man. When the avengers of the presumed treachery penetrate into the chapel and call upon the murderer to declare himself, the horrified lord of the manor points towards his daughter who, turning away from her bridegroom, falls lifeless by the coffin of her victim. This nocturnal drama, through which ran reminiscences of Lubbold-Uendiadelida, the work of my far-off boyhood, I wrote in the darkest vein, but in a more polished and more noble style, disdaining all light effects, and especially all operatic embellishments. Tender passages occurred here and there all the same, and Weinlich, to whom I had already shown the beginning of my work on my return to Leipzig, praised me for the clearness and good vocal quality of the introduction I had composed to the first act. This was an adagio for a vocal septet, in which I had tried to express the reconciliation of the hostile families, together with the emotions of the wedded couple and the sinister passion of the secret lover. My principal object was, all the same, to win my sister Rosalie's approval. My poem, however, did not find favor in her eyes. She missed all that which I had purposely avoided, insisted on the ornamentation and development of the simple situation, and desired more brightness generally. I made up my mind in an instant. I took the manuscript and, without a suggestion of ill temper, destroyed it there and then. This action had nothing whatever to do with wounded vanity. It was prompted merely by my desire honestly to prove to my sister how little I thought of my own work and how much I cared for her opinion. She was held in great and loving esteem by my mother and by the rest of our family, for she was their principal breadwinner. The important salary she earned as an actress constituted nearly the whole income out of which my mother had to defray the household expenses. For the sake of her profession, she enjoyed many advantages at home. Her part of the house had been specially arranged so that she should have all the necessary comfort and peace for her studies on marketing days. When the others had to put up with the simplest fare, she had to have the same dainty food as usual. But more than any of these things did her charming gravity and her refined way of speaking place her above the younger children. She was thoughtful and gentle and never joined us in our rather loud conversation. Of course, I had been the one member of the family who had caused the greatest anxieties both to my mother and to my motherly sister, and during my life as a student the strained relations between us had made a terrible impression on me. When therefore they tried to believe in me again, and once more showed some interest in my work, I was full of gratitude and happiness. The thought of getting this sister to look kindly upon my aspirations, and even to expect great things of me, had become a special stimulus to my ambition. Under these circumstances, a tender and almost sentimental relationship grew up between Rosalie and myself, which in its purity and sincerity could vie with the noblest form of friendship between man and woman. This was principally due to her exceptional individuality. She had not any real talent, at least not for acting, which had often been considered stagey and unnatural. Nevertheless, she was much appreciated owing to her charming appearance, as well as to her pure and dignified womanliness, and I remember many tokens of esteem which she received in those days. All the same, none of these advances ever seemed to lead to the prospect of a marriage, and year by year went by without bringing her hopes of a suitable match, a fact which to me appeared quite unaccountable. From time to time I thought I noticed that Rosalie suffered from this state of affairs. I remember one evening when, believing herself to be alone, I heard her sobbing and moaning. I stole away unnoticed, but her grief made such an impression upon me that from that moment I vowed to bring some joy into her life, principally by making a name for myself. Not without reason had our stepfather Geyer given my gentle sister the nickname of Geistchen, Little Spirit, for if her talent as an actress was not great, her imagination and her love of art and of all high and noble things were perhaps, on that account alone, all the greater. From her lips I had first heard expressions of admiration and delight concerning those subjects which became dear to me later on, and she moved amongst a circle of serious and interesting people who loved the higher things of life, without this attitude ever degenerating into affectation. On my return from my long journey, I was introduced to Heinrich Lobby, whom my sister had added to her list of intimate friends. It was at the time when the after effects of the July Revolution were beginning to make themselves felt amongst the younger men of intellect in Germany, and of these Lobby was one of the most conspicuous. As a young man, he came from Silesia to Leipzig, his principal object being to try and form connections in this publishing center which might be of use to him in Paris, whither he was going, and from which place Bourne also made a sensation amongst us by his letters. On this occasion Lobby was present at a representation of a play by Ludwig Robert, Die Macht der Verhältnisse, The Power of Circumstances. This induced him to write a criticism for the Leipzig Tageblatt, which made such a sensation through its terse and lively style that he was at once offered, in addition to other literary work, the post of editor of Die Elegante Welt. In our house he was looked upon as a genius. His curt and often biting manner of speaking, which seemed to exclude all attempt at poetic expression, made him appear both original and daring. His sense of justice, his sincerity and fearless bluntness made one respect his character, hardened as it had been in youth by great adversity. On me he had a very inspiring effect, and I was very much astonished to find that he thought so much of me as to write a flattering notice about my talent in his paper after hearing the first performance of my symphony. This performance took place in the beginning of the year 1833 at the Leipzig Schneiderherberge. It was, by the by, in this dignified old hall that the Society Euterpe held its concerts. The place was dirty, narrow, and poorly lighted, and it was here that my work was introduced to the Leipzig public for the first time, and by means of an orchestra that interpreted it simply disgracefully. I can only think of that evening as a gruesome nightmare, and my astonishment was therefore all the greater at seeing the important notice which Lobby wrote about the performance. Full of hope, I therefore looked forward to a performance of the same work at the Gewandhaus concert, which followed soon after, and which came off brilliantly in every way. It was well received and well spoken of in all the papers. Of real malice there was not a trace, on the contrary. Several notices wore encouraging, and Lobby, who had quickly become celebrated, confided to me that he was going to offer me a libretto for an opera which he had first written for Meyerbeer. This staggered me somewhat, for I was not in the least prepared to pose as a poet, and my only idea was to write a real plot for an opera. As to the precise manner, however, in which such a book had to be written, I already had a very definite and instinctive notion, and I was strengthened in the certainty of my own feelings in the matter when Lobby now explained the nature of his plot to me. He told me that he wanted to arrange nothing less than Kosciuszko into a libretto for grand opera. Once again I had qualms, for I felt at once that Lobby had a mistaken idea about the character of a dramatic subject. When I inquired into the real action of the play, Lobby was astonished that I should expect more than the story of the Polish hero, whose life was crowded with incident. In any case, he thought there was quite sufficient action in it to describe the unhappy fate of a whole nation. Of course, the usual heroine was not missing. She was a Polish girl who had a love affair with a Russian, and in this way some sentimental situations were also to be found in the plot. Without a moment's delay, I assured my sister Rosalie that I would not set this story to music. She agreed with me and begged me only to postpone my answer to Lobby. My journey to Würzburg was of great help to me in this respect, for it was easier to write my decision to Lobby than to announce it to him personally. He accepted the slight rebuff with good grace, but he never forgave me, either then or afterwards, for writing my own words. When he heard what subject I had preferred to his brilliant political poem, he made no effort to conceal his contempt for my choice. I had borrowed the plot from a dramatic fairy tale by Gotze, La Donna Serpent, and called it Daphne, the Fairies. The names of my heroes I chose from different Ossian and similar poems. My prince was called Arindel. He was loved by a fairy called Ada, who held him under her spell and kept him in fairyland, away from his realm, until his faithful friends at last found him and induced him to return, for his country was going to rack and ruin, and even its capital had fallen into the enemy's hands. The loving fairy herself sends the prince back to his country, for the oracle has decreed that she shall lay upon her lover the severest of tasks. Only by performing this task triumphantly can he make it possible for her to leave the immortal world of fairies in order to share the fate of her earthly lover as his wife. In a moment of deepest despair about the state of his country, the fairy queen appears to him and purposely destroys his faith in her by deeds of the most cruel and inexplicable nature. Driven mad by 1,000 fears, Arindel begins to imagine that all the time he has been dealing with a wicked sorceress and tries to escape the fatal spell by pronouncing a curse upon Ada. Wild with sorrow, the unhappy fairy sinks down and reveals their mutual fate to the lover, now lost to her forever, and tells him that, as a punishment for having disobeyed the decree of fate, she is doomed to be turned into stone. In Gotze's version, she becomes a serpent. Immediately afterwards, it appears that all the catastrophes which the fairy had prophesied were but deceptions. Victory over the enemy as well as the growing prosperity and welfare of the kingdom now follow in quick succession. Ada is taken away by the fates, and Arindel, a raving madman, remains behind alone. The terrible sufferings of his madness do not, however, satisfy the fates. To bring about his utter ruin, they appear before the repentant man and invite him to follow them to the nether world, on the pretext of enabling him to free Ada from the spell. Through the treacherous promises of the wicked fairies, Arindel's madness grows into sublime exaltation, and one of his household magicians, a faithful friend, having in the meantime equipped him with magic weapons and charms, he now follows the traitresses. The latter cannot get over their astonishment when they see how Arindel overcomes one after the other of the monsters of the infernal regions. Only when they arrive at the vault in which they show him the stone in human shape do they recover their hope of vanquishing the valiant prince, for, unless he can break the charm which binds Ada, he must share her fate and be doomed to remain a stone forever. Arindel, who until then has been using the dagger and the shield given him by the friendly magician, now makes use of an instrument, a lyre which he has brought with him, and the meaning of which he had not yet understood. To the sounds of this instrument, he now expresses his plaintive moans, his remorse, and his overpowering longing for his enchanted queen. The stone is moved by the magic of his love. The beloved one is released. Fairyland with all its marvels opens its portals, and the mortal learns that, owing to his former inconstancy, Ada has lost the right to become his wife on earth, but that her beloved, through his great and magic power, has earned the right to live forever by her side in Fairyland. Although I had written Die Hochzeit in the darkest vein, without operatic embellishments, I painted this subject with the utmost color and variety. In contrast to the lovers out of Fairyland, I depicted a more ordinary couple, and I even introduced a third pair that belonged to the coarser and more comical servant world. I purposely went to no pains in the matter of the poetic diction and the verse. My idea was not to encourage my former hopes of making a name as a poet. I was now really a musician and a composer, and wished to write a decent opera libretto simply because I was sure that nobody else could write one for me. The reason being that such a book is something quite unique and cannot be written either by a poet or by a mere man of letters. With the intention of setting this libretto to music, I left Leipzig in January 1833 to stay in Würzburg with my eldest brother Albert, who at the time held an appointment at the theater. It now seemed necessary for me to begin to apply my musical knowledge to a practical purpose, and to this end my brother had promised to help me in getting some kind of post at the small Würzburg theater. I traveled by post to Bamberg via Hof, and in Bamberg I stayed a few days in the company of a young man called Schunk, who from a player on the horn had become an actor. With the greatest interest I learned the story of Caspar Hauser, who at that time was very well known and who, if I am not mistaken, was pointed out to me. In addition to this, I admired the peculiar costumes of the market women, thought with much interest of Hoffmann's stay at this place, and of how it had led to the writing of his tales, and resumed my journey to Würzburg with a man called Hauter, and suffered miserably from the cold all the way. My brother Albert, who was almost a new acquaintance to me, did his best to make me feel at home in his not over-luxurious establishment. He was pleased to find me less mad than he had expected me to be from a certain letter with which I had succeeded in frightening him some time previously, and he really managed to procure me an exceptional occupation as choir master at the theater, for which I received the monthly fee of 10 guilders. The remainder of the winter was devoted to the serious study of the duties required of a musical director. In a very short time I had to tackle 2 new grand operas, namely Marschneres Vampir and Meyerbeer's Robert der Teufel, in both of which the chorus played a considerable part. At first I felt absolutely like a beginner, and had to start on Camilla von Peer, the score of which was utterly unknown to me. I still remember that I felt I was doing a thing which I had no right to undertake. I felt quite an amateur at the work. Soon, however, Marschneres' score interested me sufficiently to make the labor seem worth my while. The score of Robert was a great disappointment to me. From the newspapers I had expected plenty of originality and novelty. I could find no trace of either in this transparent work, and an opera with a finale like that of the second act could not be named in the same breath with any of my favorite works. The only thing that impressed me was the unearthly keyed trumpet which, in the last act, represented the voice of the motheress ghost. It was remarkable to observe the aesthetic demoralization into which I now fell through having daily to deal with such a work. I gradually lost my dislike for this shallow and exceedingly uninteresting composition, a dislike I shared with many German musicians, in the growing interest which I was compelled to take in its interpretation, and thus it happened that the insipidness and affectation of the commonplace melodies ceased to concern me save from the standpoint of their capability of eliciting applause or the reverse. As, moreover, my future career as musical conductor was at stake, my brother, who was very anxious on my behalf, looked favorably on this lack of classical obstinacy on my part, and thus the ground was gradually prepared for that decline in my classical taste which was destined to last some considerable time. All the same, this did not occur before I had given some proof of my great inexperience in the lighter style of writing. My brother wanted to introduce a cavadine from the Puritan, by Bellini, into the same composeress opera, Straniera. The score was not to be had, and he entrusted me with the instrumentation of this work. From the piano score alone, I could not possibly detect the heavy and noisy instrumentation of the ritornelles and intermezzi which, musically, were so very thin. The composer of a great C major symphony with an end fugue could only help himself out of the difficulty by the use of a few flutes and clarinets playing in thirds. At the rehearsal, the cavadine sounded so frightfully thin and shallow that my brother made me serious reproaches about the waste of copying expenses. But I had my revenge. To the tenor aria of Aubrey in Marskner's Vampire I added an allegro, for which I also wrote the words. My work succeeded splendidly, and earned the praise of both the public and my brother. In a similar German style, I wrote the music to my Fiend in the course of the year 1833. My brother and his wife left Würzburg after Easter in order to avail themselves of several invitations at friends' houses. I stayed behind with the children, 3 little girls of tender years, which placed me in the extraordinary position of a responsible guardian, a post for which I was not in the least suited at that time of my life. My time was divided between my work and pleasure, and in consequence I neglected my charges. Amongst the friends I made there, Alexander Muller had much influence over me. He was a good musician and pianist, and I used to listen for hours to his improvisations on given themes and accomplishment, in which he so greatly excelled that I could not fail to be impressed. With him and some other friends, amongst whom was also Valentine Ham, I often made excursions in the neighborhood, on which occasions the Bavarian beer and the Frankish wine were wont to fly. Valentine Ham was a grotesque individual, who entertained us often with his excellent violin playing. He had an enormous stretch on the piano, for he could reach an interval of a twelfth. Der letzte Hieb, a Public Biergarten. situated on a pleasant height, was a daily witness of my fits of wild and often enthusiastic boisterousness. Never once during those mild summer nights did I return to my charges without having waxed enthusiastic over art and the world in general. I also remember a wicked trick which has always remained a blot in my memory. Amongst my friends was a fair and very enthusiastic Swabian called Frolic, with whom I had exchanged my score of the C minor symphony for his, which he had copied out with his own hand. This very gentle, but rather irritable young man had taken such a violent dislike to one André, whose malicious face I also detested, that he declared that this person spoilt his evenings for him, merely by being in the same room with him. The unfortunate object of his hatred tried all the same to meet us whenever he could. Friction ensued, but André would insist upon aggravating us. One evening Frolic lost patience. After some insulting retort, he tried to chase him from our table by striking him with a stick. The result was a fight in which Frolic's friends felt they must take part, though they all seemed to do so with some reluctance. A mad longing to join the fray also took possession of me. With the others I helped in knocking our poor victim about, and I even heard the sound of one terrible blow which I struck André on the head, whilst he fixed his eyes on me in bewilderment. I relate this incident to atone for a sin which has weighed very heavily on my conscience ever since. I can compare this sad experience only with one out of my earliest boyhood days, namely the drowning of some puppies in a shallow pool behind my uncle's house in Eilben. Even to this day, I cannot think of the slow death of these poor little creatures without horror. I have never quite forgotten some of my thoughtless and reckless actions, for the sorrows of others, and in particular those of animals, have always affected me deeply to the extent of filling me with a disgust of life. My first love affair stands out in strong contrast against these recollections. It was only natural that one of the young chorus ladies with whom I had to practice daily should know how to attract my attentions. Therese Ringelmann, the daughter of a grave digger, thanks to her beautiful soprano voice, led me to believe that I could make a great singer of her. After I told her of this ambitious scheme, she paid much attention to her appearance and dressed elegantly for the rehearsals, and a row of white pearls which she wound through her hair specially fascinated me. During the summer holidays I gave Therese regular lessons in singing, according to a method which has always remained a mystery to me ever since. I also called on her very often at her house, where, fortunately, I never met her unpleasant father, but always her mother and her sisters. We also met in the public gardens, but false vanity always kept me from telling my friends of our relations. I do not know whether the fault lay with her lowly birth, her lack of education, or my own doubt about the sincerity of my affections, but in any case when, in addition to the fact that I had my reasons for being jealous, they also tried to urge me to a formal engagement, this love affair came quietly to an end. An infinitely more genuine affair was my love for Friederich Galvani, the daughter of a mechanic, who was undoubtedly of Italian origin. She was very musical and had a lovely voice. My brother had patronized her and helped her to a debut at his theater, which test she stood brilliantly. She was rather small, but had large dark eyes and a sweet disposition. The first oboist of the orchestra, a good fellow as well as a clever musician, was thoroughly devoted to her. He was looked upon as her fiancé, but, owing to some incident in his past, he was not allowed to visit at her parents' house, and the marriage was not to take place for a long time yet. When the autumn of my year in Würzburg drew near, I received an invitation from friends to be present at a country wedding at a little distance from Würzburg. The oboist and his fiancée had also been invited. It was a jolly, though primitive affair. We drank and danced, and I even tried my hand at violin playing, but I must have forgotten it badly, for even with the second violin I could not manage to satisfy the other musicians. But my success with Friedrich was all the greater. We danced like mad through the many couples of peasants until at one moment we got so excited that, losing all self-control, we embraced each other while her real lover was playing the dance music. For the first time in my life, I began to feel a flattering sensation of self-respect when Friedrich's fiancé, on seeing how we two flirted, accepted the situation with good grace, if not without some sadness. I had never had the chance of thinking that I could make a favorable impression on any young girl. I never imagined myself good-looking, neither had I ever thought it possible that I could attract the attention of pretty girls. On the other hand, I had gradually acquired a certain self-reliance in mixing with men of my own age. Owing to the exceptional vivacity and innate susceptibility of my nature qualities which were brought home to me in my relations with members of my circle, I gradually became conscious of a certain power of transporting or bewildering my more indolent companions. From my poor oboist's silent self-control on becoming aware of the ardent advances of his betrothed towards me, I acquired, as I have said, the first suggestion of the fact that I might count for something, not only among men, but also among women. The Frankish wine helped to bring about a state of ever greater confusion, and under the cover of its influence I at length declared myself, quite openly, to be Friedrich's lover. Ever so far into the night, in fact, when day was already breaking, we set off home together to Würzburg in an open wagon. This was the crowning triumph of my delightful adventure, for while all the others, including, in the end, the jealous oboist, slept off their debauch in the face of the dawning day, I, with my cheek against Friedrich's, and listening to the warbling of the larks, watched the coming of the rising sun. On the following day we had scarcely any idea of what had happened. A certain sense of shame, which was not unbecoming, held us aloof from one another, and yet I easily won access to Friedrich's family, and from that time forward was daily a welcome guest, when for some hours I would linger in unconcealed intimate intercourse with the same domestic circle from which the unhappy betrothed remained excluded. No word was ever mentioned of this last connection. Never once did it even dawn upon Friedrich to effect any change in the state of affairs, and it seemed to strike no one that I ought, so to speak, to take the fiancé's place. The confiding manner in which I was received by all, and especially by the girl herself, was exactly similar to one of nature's great processes, as, for instance, when spring steps in and winter passes silently away. Not one of them ever considered the material consequences of the change, and this is precisely the most charming and flattering feature of this first youthful love affair, which was never to degenerate into an attitude which might give rise to suspicion or concern. These relations ended only with my departure from Würzburg, which was marked by the most touching and most tearful leave-taking. For some time, although I kept up no correspondence, the memory of this episode remained firmly imprinted on my mind. 2 years later, while making a rapid journey through the old district, I once more visited Friedrich. The poor child approached me utterly shamefaced. Her oboist was still her lover, and though his position rendered marriage impossible, the unfortunate young woman had become a mother. I have heard nothing more of her since. Amid all this traffic of love, I worked hard at my opera, and, thanks to the loving sympathy of my sister Rosalie, I was able to find the necessary good spirits for the task. When at the commencement of the summer my earnings as a conductor came to an end, this same sister again made it her business loyally to provide me with ample pocket money so that I might devote myself solely to the completion of my work, without troubling about anything or being a burden to anyone. At a much later date, I came across a letter of mine written to Rosalie in those days, which were full of a tender, almost adoring love for that noble creature. When the winter was at hand, my brother returned, and the theater reopened. Truth to tell, I did not again become connected with it, but acquired a position, which was even more prominent, in the concerts of the musical society in which I produced my great overture in C major, my symphony, and eventually portions of my new opera as well. An amateur with a splendid voice, Mademoiselle Friedel, sang the great aria from Ada. In addition to this, a trio was given which, in one of its passages, had such a moving effect upon my brother, who took part in it, that, to his astonishment, as he himself admitted, he completely lost his cue on account of it. By Christmas my work had come to an end. My score was written out complete with the most laudable neatness, and now I was to return to Leipzig for the new year, in order to get my opera accepted by the theater there. On the way home I visited Nuremberg, where I stayed a week with my sister Clara and with her husband, who were engaged at the theater there. I well remember how happy and comfortable I felt during this pleasant visit to the very same relatives who a few years previously, when I had stayed with them at Magdeburg, had been upset by my resolve to adopt music as a calling. Now I had become a real musician, had written a grand opera, and had already brought out many things without coming to grief. The sense of all this was a great joy to me, while it was no less flattering to my relatives, who could not fail to see that the supposed misfortune had in the end proved to my advantage. I was in a jolly mood and quite unrestrained a state of mind which was very largely the result not only of my brother-in-law's cheerful and sociable household, but also of the pleasant tavern life of the place. In a much more confident and elated spirit I returned to Leipzig, where I was able to lay the 3 huge volumes of my score before my highly delighted mother and sister. Just then my family was the richer for the return of my brother Julius from his long wanderings. He had worked a good while in Paris as a goldsmith, and had now set up for himself in that capacity in Leipzig. He too, like the rest, was eager to hear something out of my opera, which, to be sure, was not so easy, as I entirely lacked the gift of playing anything of the sort in an easy and intelligible way. Only when I was able to work myself into a state of absolute ecstasy was it possible for me to render something with any effect. Rosalie knew that I meant it to draw a sort of declaration of love from her, but I have never felt certain whether the embrace and the sisterly kiss which were awarded me after I had sung my great aria from Ada were bestowed on me from real emotion or rather out of affectionate regard. On the other hand, the zeal with which she urged my opera on the director of the theatre, Ringelhart, the conductor and the manager, was unmistakable, and she did it so effectually that she obtained their consent for its performance, and that very speedily. I was particularly interested to learn that the management immediately showed themselves eager to try to settle the matter of the costumes for my drama, but I was astonished to hear that the choice was in favor of Oriental attire, whereas I had intended, by the names I had selected, to suggest a northern character for the setting. But it was precisely these names which they found unsuitable, as fairy personages are not seen in the north, but only in the east, while apart from this, the original Bygazzi, which formed the basis of the work, undoubtedly bore an Oriental character. It was with the utmost indignation that I opposed the insufferable turban and kaftan style of dress, and vehemently advocated the knightly garb worn in the early years of the Middle Ages. I then had to come to a thorough understanding with the conductor, Stegmayer, on the subject of my score. He was a remarkable, short, fat man, with fair curly hair and an exceptionally jovial disposition. He was, however, very hard to bring to a point. When over our wine we always arrived at an understanding very quickly, but as soon as we sat at the piano, I had to listen to the most extraordinary objections concerning the trend of which I was for some time extremely puzzled. As the matter was much delayed by this vacillation, I put myself into closer communication with the stage manager of the opera, Hauser, who at that time was much appreciated as a singer and patron of art by the people of Leipzig. With this man, too, I had the strangest experiences. He who had captivated the audiences of Leipzig more especially with his impersonation of the barber and the Englishman in Fra Diavolo, suddenly revealed himself in his own house as the most fanatical adherent of the most old-fashioned music. I listened with astonishment to the scarcely veiled contempt with which he treated even Mozart, and the only thing he seemed to regret was that we had no operas by Sebastian Bach. After he had explained to me that dramatic music had not actually been written yet, and that properly speaking Gluck alone had shown any ability for it, he proceeded to what seemed an exhaustive examination of my own opera, concerning which all I had wished to hear from him was whether it was fit to be performed. Instead of this, however, his object seemed to be to point out the failure of my purpose in every number. I sweated blood under the unparalleled torture of going through my work with this man, and I told my mother and sister of my grave depression. All these delays had already succeeded in making it impossible to perform my opera at the date originally fixed, and now it was postponed until August of the current year, 1834. An incident which I shall never forget inspired me with fresh courage. Old Beery, an experienced and excellent musician, and in his day a successful composer, who, thanks more particularly to his long practice as a conductor at the Breslau Theatre, had acquired a perfectly practical knowledge of such things, was then living at Leipzig, and was a good friend of my people. My mother and sister begged him to give his opinion about the fitness of my opera for the stage, and I duly submitted the score to him. I cannot say how deeply affected and impressed I was to see this old gentleman appear one day among my relatives, and to hear him declare with genuine enthusiasm that he simply could not understand how so young a man could have composed such a score. His remarks concerning the greatness which he had recognized in my talent were really irresistible and positively amazed me. When asked whether he considered the work presentable and calculated to produce an effect, he declared his only regret was that he was no longer at the head of a theater, because, had he been, he would have thought himself extremely lucky to secure such a man as myself permanently for his enterprise. At this announcement my family was overcome with joy, and their feelings were all the more justified seeing that, as they all knew, Beery was by no means an amiable romancer, but a practical musician well seasoned by a life full of experience. The delay was now borne with better spirits, and for a long time I was able to wait hopefully for what the future might bring. Among other things, I now began to enjoy the company of a new friend in the person of Lobby, who at that time, although I had not set his Kosciuszko to music, was at the zenith of his fame. The first portion of his novel, Young Europe, the form of which was epistolary, had appeared, and had a most stimulating effect on me, more particularly in conjunction with all the youthful hopefulness which at that time pulsated in my veins. Though his teaching was essentially only a repetition of that in Heinz's Ardinghello, the forces that then surged in young breasts were given full and eloquent expression. The guiding spirit of this tendency was followed in literary criticism, which was aimed mainly at the supposed or actual incapacity of the semi-classical occupants of our various literary thrones. Without the slightest mercy, the pedants, among whom Teak for one was numbered, were treated as sheer encumbrances and hindrances to the rise of a new literature. That which led to a remarkable revulsion of my feelings with regard to those German composers who hitherto had been admired and respected was partly the influence of these critical skirmishes and the luring sprightliness of their tone, but mainly the impression made by a fresh visit of Schroeder de Vries to Leipzig, when her rendering of Borneo in Bellini's Romeo and Juliet carried everyone by storm. The effect of it was not to be compared with anything that had been witnessed theretofore. To see the daring, romantic figure of the youthful lover against a background of such obviously shallow and empty music prompted one, at all events, to meditate doubtfully upon the cause of the great lack of effect in solid German music as it had been applied hitherto to the drama. Without for the moment plunging too deeply into this meditation, I allowed myself to be borne along with the current of my youthful feelings, then roused to ardor, and turned involuntarily to the task of working off all that brooding seriousness which in my earlier years had driven me to such pathetic mysticism. What Paulenz had not done by his conducting of the Ninth Symphony, what the Vienna Conservatoire, Dionys Weber, and many other clumsy performances, which had led me to regard classical music as absolutely colorless, had not fully accomplished, was achieved by the inconceivable charm of the most unclassical Italian music, thanks to the wonderful, thrilling, and entrancing impersonation of Romeo by Schroeder de Vries. What effect such powerful, and as regards their causes, incomprehensible, effects had upon my opinion was shown in the frivolous way in which I was able to contrive a short criticism of Weber's Euryanthe for the Elegante Zeitung. This opera had been performed by the Leipzig company shortly before the appearance of Schroeder de Vries, cold and colorless performers, among whom the singer in the title role, appearing in the wilderness with the full sleeves which were then the pink of fashion, is still a disagreeable memory. Very laboriously and without verve, but simply with the object of satisfying the demands of classical rules, this company did its utmost to dispel even the enthusiastic impressions of Weber's music, which I had formed in my youth. I did not know what answer to make to a brother critic of Labiesse, when he pointed out to me the labored character of this operatic performance, as soon as he was able to contrast it with the entrancing effect of that Romeo evening. Here I found myself confronted with a problem, the solving of which I was just at that time disposed to take as easily as possible, and displayed my courage by discarding all prejudice, and that daringly, in the short criticism just mentioned, in which I simply scoffed at Euryanthe. Just as I had had my season of wild oat sowing as a student, so now I boldly rushed into the same courses in the development of my artistic taste. It was May and beautiful spring weather, and a pleasure trip that I now undertook with a friend into the promised land of my youthful romance, Bohemia, was destined to bring the unrestrained young European mood in me to full maturity. This friend was Theodore Apel. I had known him a long while and had always felt particularly flattered by the fact that I had won his hearty affection, for, as the son of the gifted master of meter and imitator of Greek forms of poetry, August Apel, I felt that admiring deference for him which I had never yet been able to bestow upon the descendant of a famous man. Being well-to-do and of a good family, his friendship gave me such opportunities of coming into touch with the easy circumstances of the upper classes as were not of frequent occurrence in my station of life. While my mother, for instance, regarded my association with this highly respectable family with great satisfaction, I, for my part, was extremely gratified at the thought of the cordiality with which I was received in such circles. Apel's earnest wish was to become a poet, and I took it for granted that he had all that was needed for such a calling. Above all, what seemed to me so important, the complete freedom that his considerable fortune assured him by liberating him from all need of earning his living or of adopting a profession for a livelihood. Strange to say, his mother, who on the death of his distinguished father had married a Leipzig lawyer, was very anxious about the vocation he should choose, and wished her son to make a fine career in the law, as she was not at all disposed to favor his poetical gifts. And it was to her attempts to convert me to her view, in order that by my influence I might avert the calamity of a second poet in the family, in the person of the son, that I owed the specially friendly relations that obtained between herself and me. All her suggestions succeeded in doing, however, was to stimulate me, even more than my own favorable opinion of his talent could, to confirm my friend in his desire to be a poet, and thus to support him in his rebellious attitude towards his family. He was not displeased at this, as he was also studying music and composed quite nicely. I succeeded in being on terms of the greatest intimacy with him. The fact that he had spent the very year in which I had sunk into the lowest depths of undergraduate madness, studying at Heidelberg and not at Leipzig, had kept him unsullied by any share in my strange excesses, and when we now met again at Leipzig, in the spring of 1834, the only thing that we still had in common was the aesthetic aspiration of our lives, which we now strove by way of experiment to divert into the direction of the enjoyment of life. Gladly would we have flung ourselves into lively adventures if only the conditions of our environment and of the whole middle-class world in which we lived had in any way admitted of such things. Despite all the promptings of our instincts, however, we got no further than planning this excursion to Bohemia. At all events, it was something that we made the journey not by the post, but in our own carriage, and our genuine pleasure continued to lie in the fact that at Teplitz, for instance, we daily took long drives in a fine carriage. When in the evening we had supped off trout at the Wilhelmsburg, drunk good Chernosec wine with Bailen water, and duly excited ourselves over Hoffmann, Beethoven, Shakespeare, Heinz's Ardinghello, and other matters, and then with our limbs. comfortably outstretched in our elegant carriage, drove back in the summer twilight to the King of Prussia, where we occupied the large balcony room on the first floor. We felt that we had spent the day like young gods, and for sheer exuberance, could think of nothing better to do than to indulge in the most frightful quarrels which, especially when the windows were open, would collect numbers of alarmed listeners in the square before the inn. One fine morning I stole away from my friend in order to take my breakfast alone at the Schlackenberg, and also to seize an opportunity of jotting down the plan of a new operatic composition in my notebook. With this end in view, I had mastered the subject of Shakespeare's measure for measure, which, in accordance with my present mood, I soon transformed pretty freely into a libretto entitled Liebesverbot. Young Europe and Ardinghello, and the strange frame of mind into which I had fallen with regard to classical operatic music, furnished me with the keynote of my conception, which was directed more particularly against puritanical hypocrisy, and which thus tended boldly to exalt unrestrained sensuality. I took care to understand the grave Shakespearean theme only in this sense. I could see only the gloomy, straight-laced viceroy, his heart aflame with the most passionate love for the beautiful novice, who, while she beseeches him to pardon her brother condemned to death for illicit love, at the same time kindles the most dangerous fire in the stubborn Puritaness breast by infecting him with the lovely warmth of her human emotion. The fact that these powerful features are so richly developed in Shakespeare's creation only in order that, in the end, they may be weighed all the more gravely in the scales of justice, was no concern of mine. All I cared about was to expose the sinfulness of hypocrisy and the unnaturalness of such cruel moral censure. Thus I completely dropped measure for measure, and made the hypocrite be brought to justice only by the avenging power of love. I transferred the theme from the fabulous city of Vienna to the capital of sunny Sicily, in which a German viceroy, indignant at the inconceivably loose morals of the people, attempts to introduce a puritanical reform and comes miserably to grief over it. Die Stimme von Portisheim probably contributed to some extent to this theme, as did also certain memories of Die Sizilianische Vesper. When I remember that at last even the gentle Sicilian Bellini constituted a factor in this composition, I cannot, to be sure, help smiling at the strange medley in which the most extraordinary misunderstandings here took shape. This remained for the present a mere draft. Studies from life destined for my work were first to be carried out on this delightful excursion to Bohemia. I led my friend in triumph to Prague, in the hope of securing the same impressions for him which had stirred me so profoundly when I was there. We met my fair friends in the city itself, for, owing to the death of old Count Pata, material changes had taken place in the family, and the surviving daughters no longer went to Pravenin. My behavior was full of arrogance, and by means of it I doubtless wished to vent a certain capricious lust of revenge for the feelings of bitterness with which I had taken leave of this circle some years previously. My friend was well received. The changed family circumstances forced the charming girls ever more and more imperatively to come to some decision as to their future, and a wealthy bourgeois, though not exactly in trade himself, but in possession of ample means, seemed to the anxious mother, at all events, a good adviser. Without either showing or feeling any malice in the matter, I expressed my pleasure at the sight of the strange confusion caused by Theodora's introduction into the family by the merriest and wildest jests, for my only intercourse with the ladies consisted purely of jokes and friendly chaff. They could not understand how it was that I had altered so strangely. There was no longer any of that love of wrangling, that rage for instructing, and that zeal in converting in me which formerly they had found so irritating. But at the same time not a sensible word could I be made to utter, and they who were now wanting to talk over many things seriously could get nothing out of me save the wildest tomfoolery. As on this occasion, in my character of an uncaged bird, I boldly allowed myself many a liberty against which they felt themselves powerless. My exuberant spirits were excited all the more when my friend, who was led away by my example, tried to imitate me, a thing they took in very bad part from him. Only once was there any attempt at seriousness between us. I was sitting at the piano and was listening to my companion, who was telling the ladies that in a conversation at the hotel I had found occasion to express myself most warmly to someone who appeared to be surprised on hearing of the domestic and industrious qualities of my lady friends. I was deeply moved when, as the outcome of my companioness' remarks, I gathered what unpleasant experiences the poor things had already been through, for what seemed to me a very natural action on my part appeared to fill them with unexpected pleasure. Jenny, for instance, came up to me and hugged me with great warmth. By general consent, I was now granted the right of behaving with almost studied rudeness, and I replied even to Jenny's warm outburst only with my usual banter.